Welcome to another in our series of Kehillat Israel podcasts. This is a recording of Rabbi Amy Bernstein's weekly Friday morning Torah study.
We are in an interesting part of our book of Deuteronomy. It's one of the very, very few liturgical pieces we have left from biblical times. We do have Psalms, so we have, some of that certainly would have been used as liturgy in the temple. The Levites were the choir, right? The Levitical choir would have sung and would have played on the musical instruments of the time in a kind of orchestra, and singing verses of praise, from Psalms. But this is one of the few places we have actual liturgy that would have been set, that we have the direction to an Israelite, here's what you say. It's one of the very, very few that we have. These two pieces. So it's interesting in that sense that only these were preserved by the tradition. And it's an interesting way to think about liturgy in the ancient world, but certainly it still has implications for our time. So let's look at chapter 26, verse 1.
When you enter the land that the Lord your God is giving you as a heritage, and you possess it and settle in it, you shall take some of every first fruit of the soil, which you harvest from the land that the Lord your God is giving you. Put it in a basket and go to the place where the Lord your God will choose to establish his name. You shall go to the priest in charge at that time and say to him, I acknowledge this day before the Lord your God that I have entered the land that the Lord swore to our fathers to assign us.
Go on.
The priest shall take the basket from your hand and set it down in front of the altar of the Lord your God. You shall then recite as follows before the Lord your God. My father was a fugitive Aramaean. He went down to Egypt with meager numbers and sojourned there. But there he became a great and very populous nation. The Egyptians dealt harshly with us and oppressed us. They imposed heavy labor upon us. We cried to the Lord, the God of our fathers, and the Lord heard our plea and saw our plight, our misery, and our oppression. The Lord freed us from Egypt by a mighty hand, and by outstretched arm and awesome power, and by signs of portents. He brought us to this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. Wherefore I now bring the first fruits of the soil of which you, O Lord, have given me. Keep going.
Mm-hmm.
You shall leave it before the Lord your God and bow low before the Lord your God. And you shall enjoy together with the Levite and the stranger in your midst all the bounty that the Lord your God has bestowed upon you and your household.
Okay, good. So this is one ritual. We have two rituals here. This is the first ritual, and it has two parts, two components, verses 3 and 4 and verses 5 and 10. When you enter the land that Adonai your God is giving you as a nachalah, as an inheritance, and you possess it and settle in it, you shall take some of every first fruit of the soil which you harvest from the land that God is giving you. You will put it in a basket and go to the place where God will choose to establish God's name. What is that place? Jerusalem. To the altar, to the temple. The place where God chooses to establish God's name winds up being, because they didn't know what it was going to be, presumably, in the imagination of the text, right? The imagination of the author who puts this in an imaginary setting imagines that they don't know yet what that place is. So this cannot be addressed to the generation that is entering the land, can it? I'm going to say no. Why? Why can't it be addressed to them?
They don't know where it is.
They don't know where it is, and it's not going to happen in their lifetime. When is the temple built? You know.
I know. It's
Right on the tip of your tongue.
I know when it was destroyed.
All right.
400 years after.
Yes. So this is not written. The generation who comes into the land isn't going to be the one to fulfill it. It's going to be later generations than that, once they figure out this place where God will choose to establish God's name. And there's another clue that we have that means it's not just even that generation. And that clue is found in verse 3. You shall go to the priest in charge at that time. At what time? Future.
When they have identified where that place is.
Where they've identified where that place is, and ever after. Whoever the priest is at that time means the time that you Israelite are bringing your first fruits, which means this is in perpetuity. Right? They didn't know they were going to be destroyed and exiled unless you believe this is written after the exile. But the imagination is still that they don't know that they're going to be exiled. What?
Is that the forerunner of the Chag HaBikurim?
So this is Chag HaBikurim. I mean, in terms of, for each person, their own Chag. It's different than Chag HaBikurim writ large in terms of the harvest festival and bringing the first fruits of that festival. There are species that would not have been part of the Shalosh Regalim, part of the 3 pilgrimage festivals. So scholars ask, wait a minute, we have a Chag HaBikurim. We have a whole ritual for going up to Jerusalem with your first fruits. What is this? A basket? A thing? What? So it seems that with different species of fruit, you would have different times of ripening, and therefore all year long you might be collecting things that need to have this ritual associated with them, like at different times. Then it seems there was a whole nother idea, which we see in a moment, of tithing, right? And taking the tithe of your crop up to Jerusalem. And then we have the pilgrimage festivals at which everyone is supposed to come, bring from their harvest. All right. So this is supposed to be in perpetuity. This is supposed to continue. What does the person say? You shall go to the priest with your basket. So the Mishnah, is very interested. Once none of this is happening, one of the only ways to engage with it for the rabbis to express their connection and love and longing was to discuss it at length, right? Well, how do you know these were exactly the first fruits, right? So they would take a string and tie it around the first, bud that was becoming a fruit. And they would mark it. So throughout the different species that they had going at the time, they would tie a string, and then they knew to come back and clip that one and put it in the basket and milk it. So we get a lot of information from the Mishnah because they're daydreaming all day long, right, about what used to happen in the temple because it's their only connection. So the person then brings this basket to the priest and says, what? Very interesting. What's this?
My father was a fugitive. I remember. We've already read that, right?
Right?
5 through 10.
So it's interesting. This is verse 3 still.
Well, verse 3 is not liturgy. It's an action.
Reuben, look at the second half of verse 3. Va'amarta elav, and you will say to him, quote, now we get the liturgy. Higadati hayom la'Adonai. I declare this day before Yud Hey Vav Hey, right? I mean, I acknowledge this day before Adonai Elohecha, your God. Whose God? But why is he saying your God? It is an ancient custom to talk about someone of very high status, particularly somebody who was considered closer to air quotes for those of you listening to the podcast, closer to God to say your God. It means their God too, but it somehow is like you have a different relationship to that God, so they call it your God. So before the priest, you say, I acknowledge before Yud-He Vav-He, your God. My God too, of course. Kivati el haaretz asher nishba Adonai la'avotenu latet lanu. That I have come to the land that Yud-He Vav-He swore to give to our ancestors. The priest then takes the basket and sets it down in front of the altar. And then the person goes on, right? And what does the person say? This very interesting phrase.
Gives a review of history.
So the first thing the person says is, Arami Oved Avi. Can you hear the alliteration in the Hebrew? Arami Oved Avi. Yeah? This was an oral recitation. So probably it makes it easier to remember what it is you're supposed to say when there's alliteration. What does it mean? So Sarah's right. We're going to go to some kind of a recitation of history that begins with this very interesting line. Arami Oved Avi. What do we know about that Hebrew? So what's the only clear part of that Hebrew? What's the clearest part of that Hebrew?
Can we hear it again, please?
Arami Oved Avi. So what's the clear part is, and this is an aleph, not an ayin. That makes a difference. All right, so of course it reads this way. Arami Oved Avi. But this is the only one that's like really clear. Because it means what? Avi. My father. Yes, so father, yes. My father. Remember that Av in Hebrew, in modern Hebrew, means father. In ancient Hebrew, it meant ancestor. Avi is a relationship, kinship term, backward through the generation. It does not necessarily mean your biological father. So when we say that, when we open the tefillah with God of our foremothers and forefathers, right? It's avotenu. Literally our fathers, but it's our ancestors. So my ancestor, literally now my father, but it means the sense of generations, a generation at least before. So my ancestor, the Arami. In the 9th century, we know there were serious tensions between people who identified as Arameans and the Israelites. They were at war. So it is unlikely that is what this means, and it's unlikely that it's late. Right? If in the 9th century BCE there's already antithesis, they're already enemies, it has to predate that. So this is probably very, very old. If so, what's Arami? Who is the Avi? And who is the Arami? What does Arami mean? Who might this ancestor be?
Joseph.
Who?
Jacob.
Who went to Egypt?
Who went to Egypt? All right, because we get that next sentence because Reuben has read ahead carefully. He went down to Egypt with meager numbers and sojourned there. So it's got to be somebody who went down to Egypt. So I've just heard 2 options thrown out. Jacob, Joseph. Who else?
Jacob, because he went to go to his brothers. He was already there.
Lisa, it was Jacob.
But it wasn't Jacob
Because-
already there.
Ah.
He went with meager numbers. Joseph didn't go willingly. He was captured. He was brought there. He was in prison.
All right, so it doesn't say he was taken down to Egypt. So Lisa's arguing. It says he went down. Must mean something about agency.
Numbers
So,
with others.
and what?
He said with meager numbers.
With meager numbers. So Moses didn't go, Moses is not known for going down to Egypt.
Like the song, exactly. Go down,
Maybe he is little.
That's when he goes back
So,
to tell Pharaoh.
I know, it's like, so my understanding of our mythology is that Moses was born in Egypt.
Yeah.
The go down Moses is supposed to go down from where?
From exile.
From Midian. He was exiled because he killed somebody. He's a fugitive. He has to go down from Midian to Egypt. But this, right, seems to suggest somebody who goes down to Egypt who wasn't born there. So, come on, you gotta give me one more big possibility. Aramean, Aram, Padan Aram. Ha ha! Nice. Well done, Pam.
She was just waiting all along.
She's holding out. So Arami, right, that E on the end in Hebrew is like it. Right? Israelite. Yisraeli. So, possibly this is referencing Aram Naharaim. Could be referencing Padan Aram. We get those places associated, a lot with, being alongside the river. And this could be either then Yaakov or Avraham, right? All right. So Joseph, I'm just going to put in parentheses because unlikely it's referring to Joseph. Joseph, interestingly enough, is not usually listed among the patriarchs, right? He's not considered an avi, or an av, an ancestor, a forefather in the same way that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are. And of course, before them, Abraham. So likely it is referencing an ancestor figure, and that would have been one of the big ones, right? One of the big three. All right. Probably not Isaac, because Isaac never left Canaan, right? He stayed home. All right, so Arami, we've played a little bit with that. So then we're left with this, Oved. So there's two possibilities in the ancient literature, in the ancient world about Oved. It can mean something related to, and notice I don't even expect you to have a clue about this one, perish or stray. So these are two words in the ancient world that are related. We have cognates in Akkadian. We even get a cognate in Akkadian that means to flee.
That's the fugitive.
Exactly. So when scholars are trying to figure out what to do with this, I'm not going to go too much in depth here because we don't know which one of these it is. But just always remember that when you read a translation, they're having to choose from among all of the different possibilities and different flavors that this word that we don't really know what it means. Right? So that we read a translation as authoritative. A translation is always already an interpretation. And in this case, it is very clearly an interpretation. So something about it, whatever flavor we go with, perish, meaning, on the border of perishing from hunger or thirst, to stray, meaning like no real direction, kind of lost in the world, possibly wandering, or flee with the sense of fugitive. No matter which one of these you go with, it seems, given that its context is dealing with a ritual saying, you've brought me to the land that you promised this ancestor who was Oved. It probably means something about being landless, homeless in terms of a place that one's people belongs to. Yes? Because no matter which of these you take, and then you have a ritual saying, yay, we're here in the land, yay, the land is fertile, yay, God kept God's promise, it means you changed the status of the descendants, from whatever this was to having land and having place and having sacred relationship to it. So this is the beginning, that he went down to Egypt with meager numbers and sojourned there, but there he became a great and very populous nation. The Egyptians dealt harshly with us and oppressed us. They imposed heavy labor upon us. We cried to Adonai, the God of our ancestors, and Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh heard our plea and saw our plight, our misery, and our oppression. And God freed us from Egypt by a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, an awesome power, and by signs and portents, and brought us to this place, and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. Wherefore I now bring the first fruits of the soil which you, O God, have given me. Why do you know this text? You know this text.
You mentioned that it's the liturgy, but where in the service is it?
It's not generally in our service, but we say it every year.
Oh, yeah, the Haggadah.
It's the Haggadah, right? This is the core of the Haggadah. This liturgy is still in place. Just think about that for 5 seconds. From this time, you shall bring what you have to the priest and say these words. We still say these words every year. That's crazy. How amazing is that? Thousands of years we've been saying these words. Now you can point to other texts and tell me that they are core and central. I believe that. You can point to Shema, 100%. Point to the 10 Commandments, absolutely. But there is a part of me that says, this is it.
Because of the land.
Because of the sense that who we are is absolutely, fundamentally determined by our history. We are determined by the fact that who we are is a people who suffered oppression, dislocation, marginalization, disempowerment, and we had a relationship to some crazy thing we call Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh. And in that relationship, our reality changed, and we locate that change in that force that we call God. And out of our change in circumstance, we are a people who feels called to give thanks for our blessings and our bounty. This is where we start everything. We wake up in the morning and we have blessings to say. Thank you, God, right, that I woke up. Thank you, God, that my mind can discern from day and night. Thank you, God, Rokaha Aretz al Hamayim, that I wake up and stand on firm ground. Zokef Kefufim. Thank you, God, that I stood up straight this morning. Well, right, Reuben? Depending on the day is how straight we actually stand up. That's not unrelated. Our reality is not unrelated to this vast power in the universe that is beyond our possibility of understanding, but always within our capacity to experience. That is a phenomenal thing, and it's so Jewish. In its time, it's radical because pagan religion was about giving thanks to the god of fertility, the god of the land, for the gift of bounty from the land. The people that the Israelites lived among, and most of us believe arose out of, worshipped Baal at this time of year. They thanked Baal for Baal's moving through, its own forces of fertility in order to result in crops. Not the Israelites. The Israelites understood Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh to be that which makes for fertility in the soil and brings that forth is the same force that changed our circumstances from Egyptian slavery to responsible covenantal freedom. They are the same. That is a radical move in the ancient Near East. It is ethical monotheism. It is brand spanking new in the ancient world. This is one of our greatest contributions as a civilization to humanity. I'm not saying there weren't other impulses towards that happening. You can read Karen Armstrong's book, The Axial Age, where she believes humanity was at a tipping point around this time, and that all over the world you see kind of this, movement towards a new understanding of the divine, and that this is the Israelite version of it. But with Akhenaten, right, in Egypt, that movement towards monotheism, and then the reaction against it by the polytheistic temples who were going to lose their business, right? They crack down and, destroy every remnant of Akhenaten and his movement towards monotheism. So I'm not going to say it's the only impulse towards it, but it's brand new and very well articulated in our literature. So for me, as a people who identifies itself with its history and ties the God of that to the God of the soil, that our story's not separate from our gratitude. And here's the beauty for me. Okay, it goes on. What makes it even better is Ke'ilu hu yatsa mimitzrayim. Each one of us is obligated to say this in every generation. I was wandering, right? I was a wandering Aramean. Each one of us at the Passover Seder is supposed to say, I experienced the liberation, the redemption from Egypt. Me. So that we don't ever otherize those who are oppressed. If each of us says, it was I who was liberated. I was the slave. You can never turn to another person living in oppression or poverty and say, if only you would work harder. You can't ever otherize the slave or otherize those who are marginalized or disappeared or silenced or stigmatized, because you're supposed to understand it was you. That, to me, that connection, that real sense that this covenant remains in place because it's us, that is powerful. Truly powerful. So you are to take this basket and leave it before Adonai your God. You bow low, and you shall enjoy together with the Levite and the stranger in your midst all the bounty that God has bestowed upon you and your household. Why is it the ger here? Why not the widow and the orphan? Why not the poor? Why is it the ger that gets to eat this particular offering? The ger. What's a ger? A stranger.
Because at this point, this is where they're talking about being in a new place. So that's something that they're all more connected to, every one of them.
Very nice, Laura. It says the ger so that you shouldn't forget you were the ger. Who gets to benefit from this? The people who are in exactly the same situation that you were. Don't you forget it, you wealthy landed Israelite. That's who benefits, so that you make sure you identify with the ger. That was your ancestor. And in later ritual, we know us. So that is who will eat of this. Of course, it includes the poor and the widow and the orphan, we can imagine. But particularly the one who suffers not having relatives here. No protection of clan. No security about being able to work the land. The ger has very few rights, very few protections legally in the ancient world, in an agricultural society. So this is the first ritual. Any comments here?
I noticed you used the word energy to describe that God is doing the same thing in different, as opposed to the various gods lowercase, and you use the word energy to describe God. Is that, you want to comment on that?
Do I want to comment on that? For me, it's really my closest understanding of that word, God. For me, God is not being, a being. God is being, capital B. Existence, reality, capital R. That energy that holds it all together, that moves through it all, animates it all. We know that this is 99.8% energy. It's just frozen energy. For me, that's the closest word in our time I can find to identify in our linguistic world, a word that works for me. I don't believe in a God who thinks and decides. I do believe, as I'm a true Reconstructionist this way, that Kaplan, when Kaplan talks about liberation or transformation, he identifies God as the power that makes for and fill in the blank. Energy, right? The energy that makes for liberation. That is what we tapped, says Rabbi Rami Shapiro, to walk out of Egypt. That's a little different than God liberated us from Egypt, but is my theology, right? That we tap that power that allows for transformation, redemption, liberation to walk out. Blanche?
This is a bit of a tangent, but on page 1193, there's a comment in the gray area.
Mm-hmm.
The tender mother who cares for a child stands for the world as it ought to be.
As a what?
As it ought to be.
As it ought to be.
Now, this is one of the first times that motherhood has been given this status, aside from providing an heir. And I was very impressed with it.
And what is it referencing?
It's post-biblical interpretation, is all it says.
Of what? Of one of these texts?
12:10.
It's referencing what? 12:10?
Yes.
No, something odd.
Okay.
Page.
So,
Post-biblical interpretation.
I'm just curious what they're linking it to here.
It says, 28:1. Now, if you obey,
Because this is where Yitz Greenberg goes with the whole concept of Brit. So Rabbi Yitz Greenberg teaches, he's got a great new book. He says his wife made him quit doing other stuff to write it, because she was afraid he wouldn't get to it. And he's been studying this concept at deeper and deeper levels. But so this whole, which we're going to look at it's the end of our parsha, is this idea of covenant. And Brit for him, there's no olive. Brit is and all of the mitzvot that flow from Brit are those things that we do in the world that is to move it slightly closer to the world that ought to be. Mitigating the circumstances of what is more towards what ought to be. That Genesis imagines a vegetarian existence. Right? There's no killing and eating of animals in the Garden of Eden. It's not until after the flood that we have meat being permitted. So that the ideal paradise, the ideal of Eden was vegetarianism. The world that we live in is one where meat is consumed. So what Yitz Greenberg argues is, so after the flood, we get kind of this understanding of covenant, and that is that God accepts that it's not where it ought to be. So how can we behave in ways that accept it as it is and move it towards what ought to be? You can't eat anything you want. You can eat some meat. You just can't eat all the meat you want, any kind, anytime. Does that make sense? And so what I hear you saying is that there's midrashic literature that says this is what mothers do, is stand for what ought to be rather than only what is. Which is, I just would love to know where they pull that from.
It's actually on page 1211 at the bottom. It's actually a gruesome paragraph.
It's what?
It's pretty gruesome. It's on page 1211. It explains where it's going to be used.
What does it link it to?
The story of a mother who roasts her infant son in the face of being captured by the Romans.
Okay. There you go. There you go. Right? It always comes from some fantastic place, like, right, being attacked by the Romans.
I'm really interested in what you just erased. Kaplan.
I'm really interested in what you just took off the board.
You said God has the power that
makes for.
Makes for. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
I'm a really old physicist, so I'm thinking to myself, there is a difference between power and energy.
Okay, tell me.
Power, but I got to go back to my old textbooks to be sure I got this right. Power is a term that describes a force moving through distance or time. Something is pushing, a weight, a distance, and that's what power is. Energy is something else. It's like vibration, gravity, motion, whatever. So I really like Kaplan's description that what you're talking about is something that forces things to happen.
Yes.
That drives causality. That's
yes.
indeterminate. That's power.
Yes.
You use power and energy interchangeably.
I do. Not being a physicist.
Well, I got to go do some research.
That's exactly right. But I don't think they are mutually exclusive, right? They are different. They're different. It's particle wave. It's like both and that energy that is everywhere and is not necessarily moving or, directional in any sense, is potential, is present, is amorphous, that is a good, let's just say even metaphor, right? I don't believe God necessarily is energy. I think that's too small. But it's a way for me to hold the concept God that doesn't in any sense anthropomorphize or, give God a sense of thinking that makes me very nervous. Right, a God who makes decisions makes me very nervous.
I just like the force concept.
Well, I want you to work with it. Now you got to read some Kaplan, and I want you to come back to us informed. I don't know how well Kaplan knew science, assuming he did somewhat, this is certainly, I love this idea that there's that which we can't see that moves things towards, when Kaplan would say there's a human component also. That we must draw on the power that makes for liberation by walking out of Egypt. We have to move into the sea, right? It's not that just one pushes us to liberation. It's that we draw on the power that makes for liberation to step into the water. And that's what causes the waters to part. The combination of those two things. I saw a hand and, yeah.
Yeah, the way I perceive it, or kind of put it in an image, is that energy is it's passive. It's like the womb. You have all the possibilities of some things to happen or to be. And then there's I would add a third word, with the intention. The intention makes the energy become powerful to become something, or to have a direct direction, or to become something. So that's the active. The energy is there. It's the passive, it's the woman, it's the womb. And then comes the intention that lightens something, that energy, and becomes that power that moves.
Lovely.
It's the male side, because everything's male.
So lovely. So active and passive, dynamic and static, potential and actual. All of this exists, by the way, in Gersonides. In case you want to look it up, Gersonides writes a lot about the idea of potential, and our whole life is about actualizing what is in potentia, and that is the art of being human. That is our job. Through intention, we take things from potential to gashmiut, to actual yesh and ayin, isness and nothingness. Those are the poles between which we move.
I just want to make sure I understood your accent. Did you say womb?
Womb, yes.
Yeah,
so it's passive. It has the ability, and then the intention comes in and creates it into the power and makes it active. So passive, active. Okay. Yeah.
Beautiful. And this happens all the time. That's the other thing I love about this as ritual, as liturgy, is we don't recite this just as history. It is history, and our history is important, but it's living history. We are always moving from Egypt to the promised land. Always. And we are always going back there. Right? To Mitzrayim, the place of constriction. Tsar, the rabbis read. Tsarim, narrows, blinders, right? Tightness, stuckness. We are always moving back to that place, and we always must then find a way to tap that force that will allow us to push out of those places once again into a land flowing with milk and honey, and there's a 40-year journey in between. It ain't overnight, and it ain't easy, and we do it all the time. I think this became particularly powerful. It's why it's in the Haggadah. It became particularly powerful for a people in exile who were once again Arami, Oved. Once again without a place. Once again vulnerable. Fugitive. On the run. Temporary. Sojourners. Ger. Strangers. This became particularly powerful for us, and I believe is one of the ways we maintained our identity in all of the lands of our dispersion, as the language goes. This is how we did it. Is that no matter where we were sitting, no matter where our table was, no matter how temporary or how permanent we thought that table was, we all told the same story. The absolutely unbelievable miracle of the whole business is that there's Israel again. Only because this is the story we identified with and lived, no matter where we were.
And this is a story that was told the night of the first Seder in the Warsaw Ghetto.
just before the big uprising. And 3 people survived that.
And the first time this was ever told, it said, you shall tell it with girded loins and with your sandals on your feet and your backpack on, ready to go. That's how you told the story the first time. In Egypt, in slavery, in danger. Gird your loins. That always means weapons. Get ready. You may have to fight your way out. Which is why I don't have a God that makes decisions. Because where was God then? God is in the power we have to hold and remember and transcend even evil, decimating the innocent of our people. And the challenge of every time, but particularly now, the challenge is to continue to identify with the innocent in every place that are being destroyed. And what is, as an American, I have to ask, what is my part in that? The kinds of things our government condones and does. We have power now. We're in a democratic government where we are the most powerful nation on the planet. And we who have suffered such atrocious, horrific loss and torture, can we continue to come out of this? And not out of retribution, not out of revenge, not out of fear. Can we continue to come out of, therefore, you will protect the Ger, those who are powerless. And it is a mighty struggle to stay here. A mighty struggle. When I hear the level of rhetoric, when I hear the level of scary vitriol being used within our own community to talk about this, it frightens me. It really frightens me. It's a deep sadness and a very, very large concern of many of us in the rabbinate. As we look to our communities, particularly, you can tell where I am. I mean, coming up on the High Holy Days. Looking at the state of the conversation, looking at the state of our ability to hold. How do we honor this now that we have power? We still come, right? We still have the history of being traumatized and victimized and terrorized. And we are, in some ways, I mean, certainly there are places in Israel that are terrorized all the time. How do we hold both of those? And the state of the conversation is not in a good place, I don't think. And I'm deeply concerned for us as a people that if we can't continue to see this text as central, and if we can't figure out a way to have the conversation about how and are we living into this, I fear for our soul. I'm not saying what the answer is. I'm saying if we can't have the conversation, I worry we are compromising what has kept us an ethical, moral center for the planet. We've had that as our credentials for so long. And I just want to make sure we're doing the incredibly brave, courageous, very scary work of continuing to talk about what that means in our time. So I go into the holidays with hope and not a small deal of trepidation to even begin addressing, this issue. All right. Would you, Pam, please pass out the covenant and conversation? Or actually, it's probably a packet at this point. You've got Rabbi Sheffigold and...
Two different things?
Yeah. They should be together. I think Leslie put them together. Mm-hmm. Great. So just take a packet.
Oh, so this... Okay. Voila.
I'm not clear what you were saying. Are you concerned because there's so much resentment at what's going on in Gaza? And you're afraid that if we show no compassion to the Gazans, we regress to being monsters. But can you find an answer? Is there an answer?
I just want to make sure we can have the conversation. Because I feel like that's what makes us who we are, is a people willing to struggle with how hard the choices are.
But do we know if there is conversation? We don't even know.
I mean among us. I mean among us.
Among us.
Forget about them. There is no one to have a conversation with. No.
No, but in Israel, are they having a conversation about this?
Yes, and what's interesting to me is I feel like the conversation is a little more open in Israel than it is here.
That's interesting.
It's very interesting.
Yes, I understand.
That I think that journalists and other people within Israel feel more able, not totally, but more able to be critical and to have a critical conversation than we do here.
Critical about themselves?
Yeah.
So Israelis being critical about Israel?
Yeah.
Yeah.
About the government, about whatever decisions are made.
You don't think people here talk about being critical about the government?
No. You can't, I don't think you can say that in any Jewish community and feel safe. Absolutely not. Really. Of our government? Which government? Not our government.
When American Jews criticize Israel, she's saying not easily. American Jews get in trouble with each other for criticizing Israel.
Or having the discussion at levels that are real. Exactly. And that if we can't be safe with each other in this conversation, to have the conversation, I worry for who we're becoming. That's all. I mean, that's all. I mean.
To be able to say that Israel is not perfect, has not done things perfectly.
And to discuss what are our ethical concerns and about whatever situation is unfolding. And I feel like we're not at a place of having that conversation in any way rationally or with understanding of good intention on both sides, right? The vitriol is so high. Right, that it's more.
The same thing is true. Where you can't have a debate about abortion, you can't have a debate about guns. I mean,
yeah.
And not in this country.
No, it's
But I think
not a really rational debate.
amongst the Jewish, within the Jewish community, talking about Israel is such a higher hot button topic than
That's true.
talking
Right.
about abortion in the United States.
Personal survival.
It's
But maybe it's because we're the strangers. We're like the strangers. If we don't say Israel is the perfect ideal state, then we have nothing. We like these, if the ideal is to have a land of our own, it's there's the land of our own. If we start knocking the land of our own, how can we ever get to that ideal state as strangers?
Because if we don't, what is it? If we don't involve in a really serious conversation about what that state is about, then we have abandoned the ideal.
We're not allowed to abandon the ideal.
That's exactly right.
History.
That's exactly right. So we have to stay in the conversation about what does the ideal right now call for. That's the discussion I don't feel is allowed to happen right now.
Because we feel really powerless.
So that's a concern I have, that when we come out of we're powerless, then we do things that are not in line with with what I believe our greatest ethics and morals are.
But isn't that a kind of defensive, natural place to go when you're under attack from all sides, when anti-Semitism is greater now than, I mean, for those of us who lived through Holocaust years, we thought, well, now it's over. Now the world is a whole different place. Well, you know, in France, it isn't.
Yeah.
So it's a tough spot to be in.
100%. No denying that. No denying that. But I've... Yes. And because it's so painful and because the cost and the implications are so dire, in either case, we have to be really vigilant about the conversation. Okay. And not, I have a bumper sticker in my office that says, fearful people do stupid things. And I believe that. When we come out of only fear, we do stupid things. We do devastating things. We do wrong things. Sometimes we have to do things that another part of us believes is wrong. Okay. But let's talk about it. If we decide even that we have to do something that's abhorrent to us to survive, okay. But are we talking about it? Really talking about it? I don't know. I think fear still informs so much of the mood of the conversation that I worry for us.
It does. It totally does now more than ever. Because
With
people
good reason.
feel they need a place. Like, I was born in 1965. I grew up learning about the Holocaust. I always said in my head, that was then. This is the first time in this era right now that I'm like, oh my God, you know, especially like reading about Alon Gold and the things that happened to him just 6 miles away. And then the fear takes over and you go, thank God, if the shit hits, we have a place to go. We have and if you're right, it's the fear that takes in, that makes you defend Israel to the whole.
Getting back to a happy place to be here and now in Los Angeles. I was at Temple Emmanuel yesterday.
Wait a minute. Getting back to my happy place here in Los Angeles, Temple Emmanuel.
Okay, laugh already. Yeah, I was at an event for Holocaust survivors. 150 survivors were there, plus a lot of caregivers. They're very, very elderly now, and very, very frail. Yet they came to this event and had a wonderful time. And it was good. And it was good. So, and they remembered each other. That was very good too. They were so good.
The small blessings. Yeah. All right, let's go to Rabbi Jonathan Sachs and look at his second page of commentary, which is numbered his page 3. So I guess it's the third page of his commentary. It says covenant societies. You see that? Drop down to this second to last big paragraph. Covenant societies are not ethnic. Someone read that for us.
Covenant societies are not ethnic nations bound by common racial origins. They make room for outsiders, immigrants, asylum seekers, resident aliens, who become part of the society by taking its story and making it their own, as Ruth did in the biblical book that bears her name. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Or, as successive waves of immigrants did when they came to the United States. Indeed, conversion in Judaism is best understood not on the model of conversion to another religion, such as Christianity or Islam, but as the acquisition of citizenship in a nation like the USA.
Go on.
It is utterly astonishing that the mere act of telling the story regularly as a religious duty sustained Jewish identity across the centuries, even in the absence of all the normal accompaniments of nationhood, land, geographical proximity, independence, self-determination, and never allowed the people to forget its ideals, its aspirations, its collective project of building a society that would be the opposite of Egypt, a place of freedom and justice and human dignity, in which no human being is sovereign, in which God alone is king. One of the most profound truths about the politics of covenant, the message of the first fruits declaration in this week's Parsha is, if you want to sustain freedom, never stop telling the stories.
Amen. Shabbat Shalom.
You've been listening to Rabbi Amy Bernstein's Friday morning Torah study from Kehillat Israel in Pacific Palisades, California. For more information, go to our website, www.ourki.org.